how did rednecks, who are pro-labor progressives, get their moniker stolen and co-opted by white trash, anti-labor conservatives? And the answer is, of course, Reagan. No, I'm actually kidding this time. He did make the problem worse, but this time it's Nixon. But a little history lesson. For the majority of U.S. history, blue-collar and rural people skewed left on most issues. And this makes sense. These have always been the people who have been exploited by the conservative ruling class. Now, nothing exists in a vacuum, and there's certain specified exceptions to this rule. Most notably, the American South has skewed conservative on racial issues pretty much forever. When it came to issues like unions, workers' rights, social safety nets like Social Security and Medicare and unemployment insurance and minimum wage, rural and blue-collar workers always heavily supported these things. They were literally card-carrying socialists in many cases. And this is especially true for what we consider the bastion of conservatism, the American South, because the American South has benefited the most from the socialist programs that today they pretend like they hate. Hell, half of Dixie wouldn't have running water and electricity today if it wasn't for socialist programs like the TVA. And then what's less of a surprise is middle-class intellectuals have always skewed left as well. So for a long time, there was an alliance that's hard to picture today between the intellectual progressives of college campuses, professors and students, and union progressives and labor progressives of farmers and blue-collar workers and rural Americans. However, the 1960s were a very tumultuous time. We had the civil rights battles raging on, obviously, and then Vietnam loomed very heavy over the nation. Things were already stressed at the time because a lot of people who were very progressive on labor issues and social safety net issues were more conservative on the issues of civil rights, and the intellectual progressives tended to still be progressive on all the issues. This had already kind of manifested itself in the culmination of the party switch in the 1968 presidential election. But at this point, the labor unions were still very heavily a liberal political powerhouse. If you were a union member, you voted union. It didn't matter if you were upset with the social policies of one party or the other. You voted labor policy. You voted what was going to be best for your wage and the wages of the people in your industry. However, if we've learned anything from history, it's always the poor people who get sent to war and who's in unions, but lower and middle class people. So a lot of these blue collar workers ended up going to Vietnam. And we really need to understand that the time that they were in, Vietnam was the first time a modern American war had not been popular with the American public. Like on the world stage, America is that jock that peaked in high school. We're still wearing our World War I and World War II Letterman jackets, bragging about our junior and senior high school football games where we scored the winning touchdown. So going into Vietnam, people had a view of, veterans being the people who served their country and fought for freedom. They were heroes. And as a nation, we've been fed a ton of propaganda to support that. But under the weight of an unjustified, botched war in an already turbulent time in American history, a lot of service members, many of whom had no choice in going to the war, came home from a morale-crushing, losing war to a country that was outright hostile to them and a government that didn't fucking care about them. And this started driving more of a rift between the intellectual progressives, who largely avoided the draft because of their enrollment in college, and blue-collar workers who either were unable to avoid the draft or joined the war effort out of a sense of patriotism and community and family expectations, then were immediately denied the opportunity their parents and grandparents had to win a war and come home to a hero's welcome. And as a result, a lot of the blue-collar and rural Americans placed the blame for this on the anti-war protesters, who tended to be those intellectual progressives, rather than the government that sent them. And this all came to a head in early May 1970. On May 4th, the National Guard killed 4 unarmed Kent State students who were protesting the Vietnam War. And this sparked protests all across the country, most notably one on May 10th in Lower Manhattan that would become known as the Hat Riots. Here, a bunch of union construction workers showed up to counter-protest, and while the police stood by idly and watched, they violently assaulted the anti-war protesters. And though the violent attack resulted in over 100 injuries, only 7 arrests were made, and 6 of those arrests were on the anti-war side. Funny how some things just never seem to change. And then Nixon, who was a paranoid fuck struggling with his lack of popularity over the Vietnam War, saw this as an opportunity. Trying to gain some leverage with the massive political power of unions, who Republicans had never successfully been able to court because their economic policy is fucking atrocious, Nixon invited these fucking violent thugs to the White House and praised them on national television for their patriotism and love of country. And they gave Nixon his own special hard hat as a thank you. Anybody else getting like deja vu? And it can really be argued that this was the turning point. This is where blue-collar and rural workers, by and large, changed from issue-based voters to identity politics. This went a really long ways towards gutting unions' political effectiveness. Republicans, who had just been rocked by the party switch of 1968 and were trying to adjust their platforms to match their new bases, they took note and abandoned policy issues and doubled down on outrage and identity politics. This would go on to be fully exploited in the late 1970s by none other than Ronald Reagan. See, prominent Christian leaders like Jerry Falwell and Bob Jones wanted to keep their private Christian schools segregated. Reagan struck a deal with them, saying that if they married evangelicals to the Republican Party, he was racist enough to help them with that. However, campaign slogans like, "Vote for Reagan, he'll keep black kids out of Christian schools," didn't test real well with the focus groups. So they started preaching that abortion, which had been legal for the better part of a decade now with no real outrage and had actually been supported by a good portion of evangelical groups, that abortion was murder and that it was killing babies, and started getting their identity politics built up around that manufactured outrage. Obviously, since blue collar and rural people tend to be more religious, this tied a lot more of those people to the Republican Party, and that's why you get the association of rednecks being conservative today. But it's time that that association is reclaimed, because a lot of people who look like me or talk like Trey Crowder are automatically judged and dismissed because of the way they sound or the way they talk or where they live. And y'all do not need to be helping the flag-waving, Flavor Aid drinking, obnoxious minority parading through town drown out the rural progressives, the real rednecks, as it were. Because there's a lot more of us than you think. It's just a lot harder for a lot of those people to find their voice. Remember, it's real fucking easy to stand on your soapbox in the middle of a bright blue city and speak your mind to like-minded people. But have a little empathy living out here in God's country, where those people who aren't so like-minded are still your neighbors, your friends, your coworkers, your community. Because it can get lonely. In fact, it's a weekly basis that I have people reach out and tell me that they appreciate my content because it made them feel like they're not alone. It made them realize that they're not the only ones who think the way they do in rural America. And the reason that those people who are on your team feel that way comes down to that big city liberal elitism that we all tend to shrug off. Just remember to have a little bit of y'all-idarity, because the people out here need it, and y'all can't win your fights without it.